pedagogy student of Dr. Helen Marlais. I'm going to talk with you tonight about Cyril Scott, but first I'd like to talk with you guys. How many of you guys are here because music's important to you, or it's an important part of your life, or somebody you love, it's an important part of their life? Okay, and that's most everybody that's here. I want to just tell you that it is life. Music is life, and it was life for Cyril Scott. I'm going to show you here in the next few minutes how it bled into every aspect of his life and how it really informed who he is as a person. But that's the same thing for me too, right? So like I'm a father, a college professor, I'm a medical professional, I like to quilt. I've been able to infuse music through all of those different aspects. I've been able to comfort people when they're dying with music, celebrate with people at weddings, playing for their weddings. We sing and dance around in the kitchen, and I always have something blaring no matter what I'm doing, even if it's quilting. Music is absolutely life, and it's not just one singular, isolated thing that I do in my life. We've been talking about 20th and 21st century composers. I want to show you how these people are part of your life. If I was to ask you something about music, you'd probably say, if I said, name a classical composer, you might say Mozart, you might say Beethoven, you might say Chopin. You're talking about people who composed music in a stylistic period. We have 7 of them listed here: medieval, Renaissance, Baroque, classical, where Beethoven and Mozart come in, romantic period. We can think about the end of Beethoven's life as well as Chopin, but we're hanging out in 1920 and to current day today. These are the classical composers of your time right now. It's synonymous with if I said something to you along the lines of, what's your favorite Christmas movie? I just said Home Alone. Some of you would raise your hand and be like, that's mine. I remember that when I was a kid. Or It's a Wonderful Life. Or if you want to go back even further, you could say Chevy Chase, Christmas Vacation, for those of you that were in the 80s. But these composers that my classmates and I have been playing for you, they're the classic composers of your day. We're going to talk about Cyril Scott. He was born in 1879 in England to Henry and Mary Scott. Now, his father was a Greek and a Hebrew scholar. His mom was an amateur pianist, and she was absolutely vital in influencing him and developing the skill that he was gifted with in piano. I don't want to overlook the fact that I've heard a couple of my colleagues say, it was their mom that was important, or someone very early on. And for Scott, it was absolutely his mother. He was so gifted that when he was 12 years old, they sent him to a different country. How many of you guys, I see some kids in here, are around 12 years old? You're around 12. Can you imagine packing up your bags and leaving and going to a different country to study? Well, that's exactly what he did, and he was very good. I'm going to, in a couple minutes, tell you just a little bit about how great he was at the Hoch Conservatory in Germany, because he was one of their finest students at that time. In the late 1890s, when he was about 20 years old, he wrote his first symphony, and in 1909, he wrote his first piano concerto. I thought that was something that I should absolutely highlight, given the fact that we're all in the piano studio here. He toured extensively in Europe, and only about 5 months here in the US. The height of his career came in the first 20 years of the 20th century, just before World War I. And then he kind of backed off. I'm going to tell you some of the different things that he did that kind of took over. But first, he had over 400 musical compositions. How many of you guys have heard of Cyril Scott, just by a show of hands? I mean, of course, Dr. Campbell and Dr. Marlais absolutely have. Anyone else? All right, that's right. So, I mean, there was 2 or 3 of you. Given the fact that he has such a vast array of compositions here, spanning from operas, ballets, orchestral works, choral works, chamber works, piano solos, and the one that Dr. Marlais helped me select was his most noted. In 1905, he wrote Lotus. So I'll be playing that for you here, as well as instrumental solos that span from 1901 to almost when he passed away. He was still composing in the 1960s. There's a very specific reason I think many of you haven't heard about him, and we're going to talk about that here in just a second. He was known and dubbed by some of his colleagues as the English Debussy. And really, honestly, that was kind of picked apart by some of his colleagues because it reflects kind of a poorer understanding of Scott and the kind of music that he composed, as well as what Debussy composed. I told you that he was one of the finest students at the Hoch Conservatory. He was selected to be the leader of the Frankfurt group. And this is the reason I think many of us weren't familiar. I wasn't familiar with his works until Dr. Marlais said, hey, I think you should play this piece. The principal aim of the Frankfurt group was to stand apart in musical composition, education, in the mainstream conservative British musical establishment. Everything that he composed was different than that of the mainstream that was going on. And that's why other colleagues dubbed him the father of modern British music. And that actually fits quite a bit better. You'll hear in some of the stuff that I'm playing, Scott's compositions, they didn't resonate with the public. It was too different from at that time. They were like, we're not really sure that we like that. He actually became primarily known as a composer of countless popular songs and short songs and piano pieces. Now, there's something that I want to kind of bring up here, and I'm going to bring it back up here in just a little bit. How I told you music is life for me. It bleeds into all different aspects. While he was studying, he met a pianist, Helen Seward, in 1902. And she actually championed and pioneered a lot of his pieces. She would play a lot of his music, but she was a Christian Scientist. That started his interest in metaphysics, Christian Scientology, and the occult. So let's talk about different aspects of his life. He was really interested in alternative medicine. He was really interested in health foods, naturopathy, or treating disease naturally, as well as doing yoga. All forms of yoga, including tantric yoga. It's out there, you can read about it if you're interested. He was an avid writer. He would write pamphlets, and he urged the sick, even those with cancer, trust your diet, improve your health, do alternative medicine. He actually told them to avoid medics and surgeons, which I don't know is anything that we're going to get behind today. But that was part of his lifestyle. He was an alternative cancer treatment advocate, and he actually authored many pamphlets and even 2 books on the subject. He recommended people consume black molasses and cider vinegar. That was avid when I was looking up about him. Go ahead. The occult. Here's where his alternative medicine, the occult, and his music history all kind of bleed together. He actually was brought up in the Church of England, but he became agnostic. He accepted that as his stance in life. And in 1902, like I said, he met Evelyn Seward. In 1906, after meeting Evelyn Seward, he became interested in theosophy and joined the Theosophical Society of 1914. And if you're like me, you're like, what the heck is that? I'm not sure what that is. It's basically multiple philosophies that bleed together and maintain that you can have a knowledge of God, and it can be achieved through spiritual ecstasy, direct intuition, or even special individual relations, communicating in other realms. He also was a member of the London Spiritual Alliance, and he lectured for both the London Spiritual Alliance as well as the Theosophical Society, which he was a member of right up until he died. He actually would go and play music for these groups and people who had like-minded thoughts about the occult, the afterlife, that which isn't seen, which is exactly what the occult means. I wanted to touch on this a little more. That first was kind of a broad overview. Here's where some of these other things kind of bleed right into that. And we don't actually know the degree that he was involved in the occult, only because, like I said, he was an author and he'd write multiple books. He stopped writing using his name. He started writing with surnames and multiple different surnames. And when he started writing, it kind of looked like maybe he was a pupil himself, like just kind of trying to study and see what that was all about. But when someone had read his entire volume of works, by the time they get to the end, he becomes what's called a full-fledged master. In that, it's that he has a following of disciples, he's capable of performing his own miracles. He actually began to experience in mystical states of peace and joy as a result of his exposure to yoga, as well as he wanted to portray those things in his music, he wanted to portray them in his writing, and he wanted to carry them out in his life. And that's what he encouraged people that would listen to him too, like, hey, if you do this yoga, if you take this apple cider vinegar and molasses, we can cure your cancer type of thing. I mentioned earlier that his mom played a pivotal role in his life. I'll segue here for 2 seconds and just say the people that you surround yourself and the things that you decide to bring into your life absolutely have an influence on your life. I say that especially because my kids are here, I know other kids are here too. Women specifically played a heavy role in his life. He was deeply influenced by a gal named Henrietta Louise Stevenson about love and marriage. It led him to adopt a philosophy in life which we would now call polyamory now, or you don't necessarily have to be married. He was also influenced by an individual named Nelson Chaplin, and here's where kind of everything I hope will come full circle for you. Nelson Chaplin and her husband Alex, they had an alternative health resort in England called the Fir. She was a musician, and that was how he became interested and he became friends with her. However, she would be able to improvise and play the piano in translate states and improvise all types of different music. She was also able to perceive natural spirits and communicate through a language of color or sound. She also was a clairvoyant of sorts. She was able to talk with spirits. And she influenced Scott and told him, "You absolutely have this gift as well." So Scott was informed by her that he was a channel for music of nature spirits and the dead. He actually ended up settling down with a gal named Marjorie Hatson, who was a clairvoyant herself, who also communicated with the dead. So he would literally, music is what brought him to be able to know these individuals. Their influences bled into his own life. That is his thing with the occult. But like, what do we make of all this? Okay, so it's fine to know all of those different things. First, he has an extensive library. If you want to read all of it, it can be a little bit exciting, even though he was an author of semi-fictional literature, but it actually paralleled and mirrored a lot of his own life. So you actually can understand a little more if you decide to read all those volumes. And then the other thing is that he really truly was a brilliant individual. He had an unusual capacity to literally admire anyone who could teach him something, whether it was musically, spiritually, about his health, whatnot. The only other thing that I'd maybe throw in there is that he was a little credulous at times. And what I mean by that is he maybe didn't critically think through everything and would just grab it and say yes. So, next slide. He was also an artist. I wanted to show you some of the art that he drew. He was a literary scholar. I already told you that he wrote extensively, but he wrote on prose, alternative medicine, occultism, as well as poetry. And he used colorful titles, like you saw from his art. He did beautiful watercolor paintings. But he would name his titles things like The Shadows of Silence and Songs of Yesterday, blending the occult and his love for music. If we drop down to this last bullet here, he frequently used translations of Chinese poetry as the basis for his compositions. And here's where Lotus Land comes into play. It was his most undoubtedly big hit. He used Asian musical techniques common to modernist composers to represent the exotic East. What I thought was a little interesting is there's a quote that he has online that I should appeal to Eastern taste as curious because I've never been to the East, nor have I heard much Eastern music. However, I can therefore only account for the fact that by his extensive study of Oriental philosophy, that he was able to imagine what that would sound like and compose pieces like Lotus Land. You'll see throughout the piece when I play, there are pentatonic contours in there. And for those of you that don't know much about music, I'll just tell you that there are 7 semitones that make up a whole scale. If we do a pentatonic contour, we're only going to use 5 of those, and you'll hear it. It doesn't sound complete. It sounds interesting. I'll play one for you here just at the beginning before I play my piece so you can hear it. And then he fancifully decorated and influenced Chinese stringed instruments, and you'll hear some of that, how he tried to replicate that on the keyboard. You can go to the next slide. I'll play that pentatonic contour for you, and then I will play Lotus Land. It doesn't sound complete, right? All right, here's Lotus Land. you.